Beneath Romantic, one of the world's most cities, lies another Paris. A city without sunlight. A city where over 6 million people still rest in silence. Stretching for hundreds of kilometers beneath the streets, hidden behind locked gates, are tunnels so vast that even today, many parts remain unexplored. But the most disturbing question isn't why these tunnels exist, it's what people are still doing inside them. Part 1. The Underground City. Stop. This is the Empire of Death. That's the first inscription that greets anyone descending the steps leading into the Paris Catacombs. Just a few minutes ago, you were standing in the middle of one of the most beautiful and romantic cities in the world. Music blared from the roadside cafes, tourists line up in front of Notre Dame Cathedral, couples walked hand in hand along the banks of the Seine River. None of them realized. Only about 20 meters above the ground. It's a completely different world. A labyrinth hundreds of kilometers long. There is no light. There are no windows. And on both sides of the wall, it's not a rock. Instead, it's millions of human skulls and bones, neatly arranged. Estimate. More than 6 million people lie beneath Paris. More than the city's current population. The scariest thing. This place doesn't exist. But it is. It was never built to be a cemetery, so what led an entire city to bury its dead underground? If you could go back to 21st century Paris, you would find a clean, modern city teeming with tourists. But if we go back in time, about 700 years, you won't want to come here again. Medieval Paris was a crowded, congested, and extremely unsanitary city. The narrow streets were just wide enough for horse-drawn carriages to pass through. Garbage and wastewater are often dumped directly onto the streets. The foul smell was almost everywhere. Under those conditions, outbreaks of disease occurred continuously. An epidemic, a harsh winter, or it could simply be an infected wound. It can also take a human life. Death became commonplace, and every day, there are even more people who need to be buried. According to Christian tradition, the dead are often buried near churches. It is believed that this is where souls will find peace and be closer to God. Initially, this was perfectly normal, but as Paris's population grew rapidly over the centuries, things started to spiral out of control. Cemeteries are becoming increasingly crowded. The new graves had to be dug directly on top of the old ones. The new body was placed on top of the old remains. One layer is placed on top of another, day after day, year after year. There are mass graves containing thousands of people. No one remembers how many layers of skeletons lie beneath their feet. The city no longer has enough land to bury anyone else. The area most severely affected is the Saint Innocent Cemetery. For hundreds of years, almost every resident of Paris was brought here. By the end of the 18th century, this cemetery has almost reached its limit. After every heavy rain, the ground began to sink. The old tombs are collapsing. The stench of death permeated the neighborhood. Local residents have been continuously submitting complaints. There are records that say, the stench from the cemetery was so strong that it caused food in nearby shops to spoil faster than usual. This is no longer a spiritual issue. This has become a sanitation crisis for the entire city. Paris faces a question unprecedented in its history. If there's no more room on the ground, where are the deceased taken then? Answer. It's located in a place nobody would expect, right at their feet. A vast network of tunnels has existed in the shadows for hundreds of years. Initially, people dug them up to get stones to build Paris. But then, those very tunnels. It has become the largest cemetery in France. And in the next section, we will explore how an abandoned quarry was transformed into the Empire of Death beneath Paris. Part 2. The Labyrinth of Paris. How was it created? If you look at Paris from above, you will see a city that is almost perfectly planned. But if only we could see through to the ground, you will discover a different Paris, a giant labyrinth that runs in every direction. It wasn't designed according to a map. There are no straight streets, there is no town square, there is no light. There are only hundreds of kilometers of winding tunnels, crisscrossing almost the entire city. The strange thing is, no one built them to hide secrets. It wasn't meant to be a shelter either. It all started with something incredibly ordinary. Stone. Today, when gazing at Notre Dame Cathedral, the Louvre, or hundreds of other ancient buildings in Paris, very few people ask themselves, where did the stones used to build all these structures come from? The answer lies right at their feet. From around Roman times, and especially throughout the Middle Ages, Parisians began to mine a very high-quality limestone found deep underground. This type of stone is both hard and easy to work with, and has a distinctive light color. It quickly became the city's primary building material. It could be said that almost all of old Paris was built from the very ground that had been excavated beneath it. Every time a new building goes up, Another void has appeared underground. Initially, the quarries were located only on the outskirts of the city, but Paris is expanding more and more. The quarries also developed accordingly. For centuries, miners dug deeper and deeper, further, and more broadly. Nobody thought about creating a map. No one considered the long-term consequences. Their sole objective was to collect as much rock as possible. When one area runs out of supplies, they move on to digging elsewhere. The new tunnels connect to the old tunnels. Gradually, it formed a vast underground network. Until people realized its true scale, it was too late. For centuries, the people above were completely unaware of what was happening below. They built a house, built a church, built a palace, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had been hollowed out. At first, everything was fine, but over time, the supporting stone pillars began to weaken. Some of the tunnels had been abandoned. Groundwater erodes the bedrock. The cracks are appearing more and more frequently. The entire city seems to be sitting on a thin shell. Just one weak point needs to collapse. Everything above could disappear as well. The 17th of December, 1774. What the people of Paris feared has finally happened. On Rue d'Enfer, the ground suddenly collapsed. A gigantic sinkhole, dozens of meters deep, opened up in an instant. Home, coach, passers-by. They were all dragged underground. The entire city was in a state of panic. No one knows how many other places could collapse at any moment. For the first time, the Parisian authorities were forced to seriously consider what lay beneath their feet. Following the sinkhole, King Louis XVI established the Paris Quarry Inspection Agency. Their task seemed very simple: explore everything that lies beneath the ground. But when we started the survey, they have just discovered a shocking truth. The tunnel system was vaster than anyone had ever imagined. It stretches for hundreds of kilometers, nestled beneath residential areas, churches, and palaces. There are stretches of road that have remained untouched by human footsteps for centuries. And even though they've been mapping for years, even today, there are still areas of this network that have not been fully studied. At that time, no one could have imagined that. The newly discovered network of mines will soon solve another crisis for Paris. It's not a construction crisis, it's a crisis of the dead. Because, in just a few years, millions of skeletons will be lowered into these very tunnels, and an abandoned quarry. It will become the world's largest cemetery. Part 3. The largest mobilization in Paris history went 6 million. In 1774, the Parisian authorities finally understood that the entire city was situated on a giant underground labyrinth. But they still have another, more pressing problem. One problem is not at the feet of the people, which lies right on the ground. Parisian cemeteries are completely overflowing, and now, they began to threaten the lives of those who were still alive. For centuries, the Saints' Innocent Cemetery was the largest burial ground in Paris. Hundreds of thousands of people have been brought here, then that number increased to millions. Old graves are constantly being dug up to make room for new bodies. There are mass graves several meters deep, containing the remains of thousands of people. Over time, the ground became almost incapable of holding anyone else. The smell of decay permeated the entire neighborhood. Especially in the summer, the air becomes so heavy that local residents constantly file complaints. Food store owners say their goods spoil faster. People living near the cemetery believe that the cemetery itself is poisoning the entire neighborhood. An increasing number of doctors and officials are warning that, without action, Paris could face a public health catastrophe. Then an incident occurred that made further delay by the authorities. Following a heavy rainstorm in 1780, the wall of a basement next to the Saints' Innocent Cemetery suddenly collapsed. Soil, rocks, remains, and material from the burial site spilled inside. These are no longer just rumors. That is clear evidence that the cemetery has exceeded its limits. Just a few months later, the authorities decided to close the Saints' Innocent Cemetery. But closing down only solves half the problem. What's much more difficult is, what should be done with the millions of skeletons that have been lying there for centuries? Finally, the authorities found the answer in the most unexpected place. Abandoned quarries beneath Paris. They are vast, rarely used, and it lies deep enough not to affect life on the surface. That seemingly crazy idea was quickly approved. All the remains from the old cemeteries will be moved down into these tunnels. Not a few thousand people, not tens of thousands of people, but it's millions of people. This will become one of the largest relocations of human remains in history. The move began in 1786, but what's special is, all activities take place at night. After the city fell asleep, horse-drawn carriages covered with black cloth silently left the cemetery. The priests led the convoy. They walked along, reciting prayers for the deceased. Behind them were carts piled high with bones and remains. The convoy slowly made its way toward the abandoned quarries south of Paris. Upon arrival, workers used pulleys and vertical shafts to lower each batch of remains into the ground. Night after night, month after month, year after year, that work almost never stops. Initially, only remains from the Saints Innocents Cemetery were moved down. But then the authorities decided to expand the plan. More and more old cemeteries in Paris are being closed down. The remains from churches, monasteries, and other cemeteries were also gradually brought down into the ground. This process spanned several decades. An estimated 6 million people, ranging from the poor and merchants to nobles and victims of epidemics and revolutions, eventually converged in one place. There is no longer any distinction between rich and poor, no longer in a position of power. Beneath the ground, everyone is the same. Initially, the remains were simply piled in large heaps in the tunnels. But as the numbers increased, things became chaotic. At the beginning of the 19th century, the engineers decided to reorganize everything. They used skulls and thigh bones to create neat walls. Behind those walls were countless other bones piled up in layers, not for decoration, and to save space. But that very arrangement created a scene that was both strange and it was haunting. That's the image millions of tourists still see today. After years of relocation efforts, Paris has finally resolved its cemetery crisis. But in return, the city has created a place unlike anything seen before in history. A labyrinth hundreds of kilometers long. Inside are the remains of approximately 6 million people. And right at the entrance to that place, a sign was placed as a warning to anyone who wanted to proceed. Stop. This is the Empire of Death. Part 4. Entering the Emperor of Death. Today, if you want to visit the Paris Catacombs, your journey begins with a very ordinary door. There was nothing to indicate that beneath lay the final resting place of approximately 6 million people. You buy the ticket. Line up. Then we started going down. Each step of the staircase is made of stone. Each spiral is connected to the next. The sunlight gradually faded behind us. The air is getting colder, more humid, and it was so quiet you could hear your own footsteps echoing from the tunnels ahead. After climbing about 130 steps, you'll be nearly 20 meters underground. That's the moment you officially step into a completely different world. At first glance, these tunnels don't seem scary at all. They were simply long corridors of limestone stretching into the darkness. Low dome, rough stone wall. Occasionally, additional support pillars are built to prevent collapse. But the deeper we went, the more you realize how incredibly vast this place is. The entire network of tunnels beneath Paris is estimated to be over 300 kilometers long. However, visitors are only allowed to pass through about 1.5 kilometers. The rest was sealed shut, through iron gates. Or simply, it means disappearing into the darkness. That means what visitors see is only a very small part of the entire labyrinth. Then you see it. An inscription is carved right on the stone gate. Arrête, c'est ici l'Empire de la Mort. Translated into Vietnamese. Stop, this is the Empire of Death. No one knows exactly how this sign was placed here to scare tourists, or simply a reminder. But after stepping through that gate, no one felt this was an ordinary sightseeing trip anymore. The first sight left most people stunned. On both sides of the wall, it's no longer stone. Instead, they were human skulls arranged in perfectly straight rows. In the middle are interwoven femur bones, forming a cross shape or symmetrical patterns. At first glance, they look like works of art. But when you look closely, you will realize that each skull once belonged to a different person. A father, a mother, a child, a soldier, a businessman, a priest, or a victim of the epidemic. Everyone is silent now, nameless, ageless. There is no longer any trace of their lives. Many people thought that the entire wall in front of them was built from human bones. But that's not entirely true. The skulls and thigh bones that tourists see are only the outermost layer. Behind them were tons of other bones, piled up in large heaps. This arrangement originated in the early 19th century. The original purpose was entirely practical. It saves space. This also helps to make the tunnels neater and easier to manage. But the result created one of the world's most haunting images. There's one thing that surprises many tourists. That's not scary, it is silence. Underground, there was almost no sound, other than the dripping of water. The wind whistled through the tunnels, and footsteps echoed from the stone walls. There was no traffic noise. There were no human voices. There is no natural light. It just feels like time has stopped for a very long time. Perhaps that's why many people describe this place as not resembling a cemetery. It's like a city that has been forgotten by time. The most thought-provoking aspect is not the number of human bones. It's the story behind them that matters. Among these approximately 6 million skeletons are those of people who had survived the bubonic plague. There are victims of famine, There were nobles, there are homeless people, some children haven't yet reached adulthood, there are people who witnessed the birth of modern France. And there are also people who have never been mentioned in any history book. They used to have families. I have friends. I have a dream. But in the end, they all lay side by side, in the darkness. For tourists, the journey almost ends here. But for some people, this is just the beginning. Because behind those locked iron gates, there are still hundreds of kilometers of tunnels that are not open to the public. There are no lights. There are no signs. There were no rescue workers. However, for many decades, there are still people secretly trying to get in. They call me cataphiles. And in the next section, we will explore the secret underworld of those who consider the labyrinth beneath Paris their second home. Part 5. Cataphiles, the people who live in the city of the dead. For most people, the Paris Catacombs are simply a tourist attraction. You buy a ticket, follow the designated route, admire the walls made of human skulls and bones, and then return to the surface after about an hour. But that's only a very small part of the whole system. What few people know is that over 99% of the tunnel network beneath Paris remains closed. There are no lights, there are no signs, there are no tourists, and you're not allowed to enter either. However, for decades, there have been people who defied all prohibitions to explore this place. They are called cataphiles. If translated simply, cataphile means lover of catacombs, but that name still doesn't quite describe them. For many cataphiles, the labyrinth beneath Paris is not a graveyard, it's a different world. A second city exists parallel to Paris on the surface. Some people begin exploring this topic while they are still students. Some people spend over 20 years just memorizing every turn, every landmark, and every small path in the labyrinth. They knew roads that even many city employees had never set foot on. Some people even drew their own maps, because there was no official map that fully depicted the entire tunnel system. What makes the network beneath Paris so special is not just its length of over 300 kilometers, but there's also its complexity. There are corridors wide enough for small cars to pass through, but there are also sections so narrow that an adult has to bend over or crawl to get through. There are places that are dry, like a normal basement, but just a few hundred meters later, there were flooded sections or partially collapsed tunnels. If you don't know the way, you have almost no chance of finding your way out on your own. That's also why entering restricted areas without permission is always considered extremely dangerous. Over the years, cataphiles have left their mark underground. They gave some of the rooms names. Many walls are covered in graffiti and artwork. There are places that become meeting points for expedition groups. There have even been small concerts held underground. Sound reverberating through the stone tunnels creates an experience that no theater above ground can offer. For cataphiles, this is more than just a place to explore. It's also part of Paris's underground culture. However, all of these activities are illegal. If discovered in a restricted area, they could be fined for trespassing. However, the most famous story about cataphiles actually began in 2004. During a patrol, police officers specializing in monitoring the underground tunnel system discovered a completely unusual room. What's inside isn't human bones. It wasn't an old warehouse either. It was a secret movie theater. There is a large projection screen. There is a projector. There are seats available. The electrical system is working. There was even a small bar and a telephone line neatly installed. Everything looks as if this place is still being used regularly. That was a shocking discovery. To construct such a space underground, the builders must have a thorough understanding of tunnel systems and require a significant amount of preparation time. The police decided to leave to prepare a force to return and investigate. 3 days later, they returned. But it's all gone. The projector is gone. There are no seats left either. The wires were completely stripped away. The bar disappeared. The room was almost completely cleaned. The only thing left was a small piece of paper with the following words: "Don't try to find us." To this day, no one knows exactly who built that movie theater. No one has ever been arrested for this incident. It has become one of the most famous mysteries of the Paris Catacombs. However fascinating it may be, the labyrinth beneath Paris remains an extremely dangerous place. There is no GPS signal here. The phone signal is very weak or completely gone. Many tunnels look so similar that even experienced people can get disoriented. Just one wrong turn, and you could be driving for hours without realizing you're going in circles. Many people had to call for rescue services. And there are also those people. He never returned to the ground on his own. Part 6. The man who disappeared 11 years under the heart of Paris. Throughout its more than 2 centuries of existence, the Paris catacombs have given rise to countless mysterious stories. Some stories are just rumors. There are legends that have been woven together over generations. But there are also events that have been recorded in history, and the story of Philibert Espert is one of them. Even to this day, this name remains associated with the most terrifying warning for anyone wishing to venture into the labyrinth beneath Paris. Philibert Espert was a doorman at the Val de Grace Hospital in Paris in the late 18th century. In 1793, amidst the turbulent period of the French Revolution, he suddenly disappeared. Nobody knows where he went. Nobody knows what happened. According to the most widely circulated theory, Philibert secretly descended into the old underground quarry system. Some believe he was searching for a forgotten wine cellar from an old monastery. Some also say he simply wanted to explore tunnels that very few people had ever set foot in. Whatever the reason, he got off, and never to return. At that time, the system of tunnels beneath Paris had not yet been fully mapped. There are no electric lights, there are no signs, there is no GPS device, just one wrong turn. All directions became exactly the same. In complete darkness, humans almost completely lose the ability to determine direction. Researchers say that when there is no light or landmark to orient oneself to, the brain easily creates the sensation that one is moving in a straight line, while in reality, one is constantly moving in a circle. That makes getting lost in a labyrinth like the Paris Catacombs incredibly easy. Maybe that's exactly what happened to Philibert. Try to imagine. You only need to bring a torch or an oil lamp. After a few hours, the fire began to die down. Then it went out completely. All around us was absolute blackness. You can't see your own hand. I don't know where the entrance is. I didn't know where the exit was either. Every step leads to a new fork in the road, and each wrong decision takes you further away from the path back. In a labyrinth hundreds of kilometers long, the chances of survival were almost zero. It wasn't until 1804, about 11 years later, that a group of underground workers discovered a human skeleton. The body lay in a narrow hallway. Next to them were still pieces of tattered clothing. Thanks to the bunch of keys and some personal belongings left behind, it was determined that the person was Philibert Espert. What makes the story even more haunting is the location where the body was found. According to many sources, he was only a short distance from an escape route. If you take the right few turns, perhaps he could have returned. But in the absolute darkness, just one wrong decision meant he would never see the sunlight again. Today, a small plaque remains in the Paris Catacombs, at the location believed to be where the remains of Philibert Espert were found. It's not particularly outstanding. Many tourists even walk past without noticing. But for those who love the history of the Paris Catacombs, this is one of the most haunting places. It reminds us that this labyrinth is not just a repository for the remains of millions of people. It has also claimed the lives of those who entered, hoping to find a way out. However, Philibert's story is only the tip of the iceberg. Over the years, the Paris Catacombs have also been associated with a series of rumors about mysterious voices, apparitions in the tunnels, and videos allegedly capturing unexplained events. So what is the truth? Are these just legends embellished to add to the eerie atmosphere of this place? Part 7. Mysteries and Legends Under the Heart of Paris. If you ask any Parisian about the catacombs, you'll get two kinds of answers. The first type comes from historians. They would say this is just a historical site, an old quarry system converted into a repository for the remains of some 6 million people. But the second type, it came from the cataphiles, who regularly frequented the forbidden tunnels. Over the years, they have recounted countless strange stories. Some people believe it is a natural phenomenon. Some people believe it's just an illusion created by spending too much time in the dark. But there are also those who assert there is something beneath Paris that science has yet to fully explain. One of the most frequently discussed phenomena is hallucinations caused by enclosed environments. Experts suggest that when people spend too much time in darkness, without natural light, without knowing day or night, and with almost no surrounding sound, the brain begins to process information in a different way. The sound of dripping water was constant. The wind whistled through the cracks in the rocks. Or perhaps it's the sound of your footsteps echoing from multiple directions. Sometimes it feels like someone else is walking behind you. Many people have reported turning around multiple times because they thought someone was following them. But each time it happened, behind it was just an endless, pitch-black corridor. Some cataphiles also recounted the strange feeling of exploring the deeper areas of the labyrinth. They said there were sections of the tunnel where they suddenly felt suffocated, anxious, or wanted to leave immediately for no apparent reason. Psychologists consider this a perfectly normal reaction. Closed spaces, lack of light, and prolonged isolation can cause the body to enter a state of stress. Heart rate increased. My breathing became more rapid. The brain begins to warn of danger, even when there is no real threat around. That's also why many people believe they've felt something underground. Perhaps the most famous story, involving the Paris Catacombs, emerged in the early 1990s. It's a video of a man who is believed to have gotten lost in the tunnel system. The camera shook violently as the person repeatedly ran through the dark corridors. His breathing became increasingly rapid. Finally, the camera fell to the ground. The image freezes, but the person holding the camera, they never appear in the frame again. The video quickly went viral and became one of the most famous mysteries surrounding the Paris catacombs. Many people believe the man has gone missing. Others argue that this is just a short film or a staged performance intended to create a creepy atmosphere. To date, there is no concrete evidence to prove that the video actually depicts a real incident. But it is precisely this ambiguity that has kept the story being talked about for decades. Besides the rumors about ghostly figures or voices in the tunnel, there is something far more certain. It's the feeling of insignificance that humans experience in this place. Standing in the middle of a long corridor, surrounded by millions of skeletons, it's hard not to think about time. The people buried in the Paris catacombs once lived lives just like ours. They used to walk on those streets. I used to work there. We once loved each other. I once had hope for the future. But in the end, all differences in wealth, status, or power disappear. All that remained were identical skeletons. Perhaps that's why the Paris catacombs inspire more than just fear. It also makes people think. To this day, much of the network beneath Paris remains sealed off. It's not because people are afraid of ghost stories, because simply losing your way in that labyrinth, which spans hundreds of kilometers, can have extremely serious consequences. Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Paris catacombs doesn't lie in ghosts or curses, but it lies in its sheer scale. Another city. It exists right beneath the feet of millions of people. Every day, Paris remains bustling with the sounds of traffic, crowded cafes, and throngs of people. Meanwhile, it was only about 20 meters above the ground. It remains a world shrouded in darkness, a world where time seems to have stopped more than 200 years ago. And perhaps, that is precisely what makes the Paris catacombs one of the most mysterious and haunted places in the world. Part 8. The End. The city Paris never wants you to see. There's a very interesting paradox about Paris. Every year, tens of millions of people fly here from all over the world. They lined up to see the Eiffel Tower, take a photo in front of the Arc de Triomphe, take a stroll along the Seine River, enjoy visiting cafes that have been around for hundreds of years. For most people, Paris is a symbol of romance. It is the city of lights. It is one of the most beautiful places in the world. But very few people realize that, right beneath their feet, yet another city exists. A city without a sky. There was no sunrise. There is no life. For over 200 years, the Paris catacombs have remained virtually unchanged. Millions of human remains are still in their rightful places. The stone tunnels stretch silently into the darkness, and the inscription, "This is the Empire of Death," continues to welcome those brave enough to step down. This place is more than just a cemetery. It is a part of Parisian history. It serves as a reminder of a time when the city grew so rapidly that even the dead had no place to rest in peace. Instead of erasing that past, Parisians have chosen to preserve it, transforming an urban disaster into a unique historical monument unlike any other in the world. To this day, engineers continue to reinforce sections of the tunnel that are at risk of collapse. Historians are still studying the remaining traces. Meanwhile, dedicated police forces continue to patrol restricted areas to prevent unauthorized entry. This shows that, despite having existed for hundreds of years, the network beneath Paris remains a living part of the city. It has not been forgotten. It's just, most of us don't see it. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about the Paris catacombs isn't the 6 million skeletons, nor are they stories about missing people or underground legends. It's not that it's always there, silently, right at the feet of millions of people. The subway runs past every day, vehicles lined up bumper to bumper on the avenues. Tourists laugh and chat in the old streets. No one thought that they were only about 20 meters away. It is the final resting place of millions of people who once lived, loved, and walked along those very paths. History is often written in palaces, churches, or town squares. But sometimes, history is also hidden underground. Not through the pages of a book, but through those silent skulls. Perhaps that is why the Paris catacombs have continued to fascinate people for hundreds of years. Not just because it's mysterious, not just because it's scary, because it forces us to confront a truth that everyone knows, but very few people want to think about. Whether rich or poor, whether famous or unknown, whether you've changed the world or just lived an ordinary life, our ultimate destination, they are all the same. If you ever had the chance to visit Paris, would you choose to stand under the lights of the Eiffel Tower, or would you be brave enough to descend into the Empire of Death, to explore the secret city hidden beneath the earth? Please share your answer in the comments. And if you love stories about mysterious places, lost civilizations, and little-known corners of history, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next exploration journeys. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.